So just a little bit more about my background. I come to performance from a user experience background. So doing a lot of usability testing and actually pulling people into labs and putting them through their paces on sites and applications and seeing how they actually respond it kind of one-on-one. So it's basically about as opposite from APM as you can get. Or maybe it's the same, but sort of at the opposite end of the spectrum. So first, before I get started, I want to ask everyone a quick question, or a little survey of the audience. How many people in this room have, when they've been using a slow site on their phone, have sworn at, yelled at, or thrown their device? All right, you guys are so honest. Okay, so my next slide. So this is, and I wondered this once, and so I actually went, I sort of thought, like, I wonder if anybody has ever actually measured, the impact of slow pages on people and in this kind of format. And of course somebody has. I found this survey by Tea Leaf where they found that 38% of users, mobile users, have done one or more of those things, and 62% of mobile users are probably liars, but that's okay, we'll forgive them. So today what I want to cover is why care about mobile web performance. That's kind of a no-brainer, obviously, with this particular audience. But I want to talk about that really quickly. Why do we want to study them at a neuroscientific level when we have all this great performance measurement data? What is emotional engagement research? I want to talk a little bit about our methodology, how we performed our study, and then what were our key takeaways from our study and kind of what are our next steps. So you've probably heard this a lot in the last day if you've been here since the beginning. It's a mobile-first world. I mean, there was a really great panel yesterday I was very privileged to be on alongside Liza and Lara Swanson and Guy Pajarni, where it was a lot of talk about mobile and what does mobile even mean? Does it mean smartphones? Does it mean tablets? Does it mean apps? Whatever it means, really, let's put this in perspective. When I think mobile first, I think we live in a world where people are more likely to use something that they hold in their hands and carry around more than they are likely to sit at a computer and go tippity tap. That to me is, in the simplest term, how I define mobile first. This is the world we live in. Interesting stat from eMarketer, where they recently announced that according to their projections, by the end of 2014, 1 out of 4 of every human being on the planet will have a smartphone. And it's not 1 out of 4 of every adult. It's not 1 out of 4 of every person in the Western world. This is 1 out of 4 of every single human being on the planet. That's huge. That's mega saturation. More numbers. 55% of all time spent on retail sites takes place on a mobile device. That's actually a number from last summer that was released by ComScore. I'm expecting them to release new numbers because it was about this time last summer that they released that particular number. And that's only going to go up. When I actually cited the statistic last fall at another conference, Stuart McMillan, who works for a shoe retailer called I can't pronounce it right. It's in the UK. Shoe. I'm supposed to say it like Sean Connery. He told me shoe.com. Told me that they're finding that already the stat that I cited earlier about 55% of all time is spent on retail. They're seeing that when they look at their user numbers, and they're seeing that at 1% a month of their desktop users are becoming mobile users. And how they break that down is 32% from smartphones, 21% from tablets, and it's desktop that's going down 1% a month. And this is what that looks like for them from February 2012 to last fall. So that big blue area that you see that's shrinking is desktop, and those other areas, tablet is the green area on the top, and the red area is smartphones, is what's growing. So I find that really, and he doesn't think it's anything particular they're doing. He, like, on their site, obviously they're trying to build the best possible experience across all platforms, but he just thinks this is actually just an indicator of where users are at. 26% of total e-commerce sales by 2017, 26% of total e-commerce sales are going to come from mobile devices. So you can see that total e-commerce growth is that yellow line on the bottom between now and 2017. So it's going up. That's not a big surprise. Oh, geez. Okay. And that red line is m-commerce. And it's a little bit of a faulty diagram. I should actually have two different charts. It's not like mobile is overtaking. It's just to show just comparing the kind of exponential rate of growth for mobile over the regular rate of e-commerce. And interesting stuff. This is from Keynote's 2012 Mobile User Survey, where they found that 2 out of 3 mobile users say that they expect pages to load in 4 seconds or less. So this is a stated need that comes from a survey. We found at Radware every fall we release a mobile e-commerce performance State of the Union. It's a very unwieldy title, but it's a good document to read if you care about e-commerce performance, where we look at the top 100 e-commerce sites and we measure load times across a variety of devices. And what we found is for the iPhone, which was the device we focused on in terms of the final metrics, the median site took almost 8 seconds to load. Only 2% of the sites we tested loaded in under 4 seconds, and then 20% took 10 or more seconds to load. And that's on iPhone over Wi-Fi. So, obviously we're not meeting that 4-second target yet, or 98% of us aren't anyways. And even when we looked at MDOT pages and tested those, the median homepage for the MDOT version of a site was over 4 seconds. So that, again, that's a median. So again, not really hitting that target. And then another number, I'm almost done with the numbers and charts, I promise, is that the interesting thing is people think that mobile browsers, mobile users are only browsing. They're not shopping. They're not using their shopping carts. And so it's kind of like, do I really need to focus on mobile? Well, we know that mobile users are trying to shop online because we know that they actually, they're using their shopping carts, and we know that because they're abandoning their shopping carts. So at Google I/O last summer, they revealed some really interesting stats, which were that standard abandonment rate is about 70% for a desktop site. That's the average and for mobile shopping carts is 97%. That's not all to do with performance, although we do know that like 1 out of 5 users say they will abandon their shopping cart if the pages aren't responding quickly enough, whatever that means to them. But it's just, that's part of the problem is also just how checkout is designed. Are there too many pages? Are there too many form fields? That sort of thing. But performance definitely is one factor in that abandonment rate. And then, over at Radware, I used to work for a company called Strangeloop, which was acquired by Radware about 1.5 years ago. And at Strangeloop, we were really lucky because we had a customer who wanted to actually find out, what if my pages are slower for mobile? Like, does that actually have a measurable difference in terms of metrics I care about? And they actually allowed us and worked with us to artificially throttle pages for very small cohorts of their traffic, but significant enough numbers that when you've got millions of transactions per month, you can still derive good numbers from just shunting a small number of those people through different experiences. So we kind of did an ABCD test where most users got the optimal experience, and then we throttled some users basically at a 200 millisecond HTML delay, some had a 500 millisecond HTML delay, and some had a 1,000 millisecond HTML delay. And what we found is 200 milliseconds, the results are pretty negligible. At 500 milliseconds, though, that's when we saw bounce rate dropping by almost increasing by almost 5%. Don't know why that negative is there. And conversions dropping by almost 2%, and page views dropping a lot, like almost 6%. And then at 1,000 milliseconds, the numbers get even higher than that. Like a 3.5% hit to your conversion rate doesn't sound like much. That's a lot, especially if you do the math over the course of a year. And then there's a long-term impact. There numerous studies show that when people abandon your site because it's too slow, they will go to a competitor site and they will not return to your site. So according to this one survey by Harris Interactive, that found that 43% of people will not return to your site and would go to a competitor site next. So this brings me to why neuroscientific mobile testing? It looks cool. You get to wear a really awesome headset, and it looks like something out of the Matrix. But what's the value of doing this? And this study that we did was actually inspired by a study that was done by a company called Foviance for CA Technologies, and this study kind of it was released on the world, and I discovered it a year later, and I was really surprised that it had sort of lain fallow for so long, and nobody had really run with it. What's interesting was that they did a study of desktop users where they throttled the connection from anywhere from 5 megabytes to 2 megabytes, from 5 megabytes down to 2 megabytes, which is pretty significant. And they found that participants had to concentrate up to 50% harder throughout the transaction to stay engaged with, and complete the task. And then afterward, the long-term effect was that participants reported they had very negative brand associations with the sites that they had been doing these transactions on. So I thought this was really interesting. And every time I just want to go back for a second. So I wrote about this on my blog. I blog at Web Performance Today. And every time I wrote about this particular type of finding, just the neuroscience of performance, we get tons and tons of hits. Like the page views on the blog would just go through the roof, and people would retweet it. And I think that it's great to have massive data sets and to look at all your numbers and to have that material to work with. But I think that people really are very attracted to just the human element. At the end of the day, we like to also picture individuals using our pages and having almost a real life avatar of just this is what my site is actually doing to a real person. So this is a stat that kind of blew my mind when I first read about it, which is that 95% of our decisions are made at the subconscious level. So it's hard to wrap our heads around, especially if you're a technologist or a statistician, somebody who has both their feet firmly planted in the logical, rational world. It's hard to reconcile yourself with the fact that really that logical, rational world is only governing about 5% of what you do. We tend to think of ourselves as being like this, but in actuality, we're all more like this behind our eyes. There's actually another interesting stat or study that I read where apparently patients who have received neurological damage to the emotional centers of their brain, but no other damage at all. So their IQ is intact. They're perfectly capable of going through, understanding a rationale and all that. They, when they're confronted with needing to make a decision about something, they actually can't because the emotional center of the brain is damaged. So we actually rely on the emotional center of our brain to make decisions. So here's the problem with surveys. I like surveys. I think you can get really interesting findings from surveys if you stick with very concrete facts about that people can tell you that they aren't going to be kind of running through filters of what they believe. But the fact is that survey-based research is post-cognitive. We'll talk about that in a second. But thinking and talking about what you think you believe distorts and changes what you think you believe. It's like that game of telephone that they get you to play in elementary school, where a message starts off over here and you whisper it in the ear of the person next to you, and it goes around the room and comes out horribly distorted at the other end. It's a pretty grandiose analogy for what is going on from the moment that we actually feel something to thinking about that feeling, trying to find words for that feeling, then finding somebody that we can talk to about that feeling and crafting the message and articulating our message about our feeling so that other person will understand it. That's a lot of noise going into that original feeling. So this is I just really like this graphic. It just shows a really simple cognitive timeline. So you can see, has anyone here read Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow? Yeah, this is a great book. I highly recommend it. And this basically, he touches on this research in quite, well, actually goes quite deep into this research, where we have our system 1, which is, our implicit precognitive responses to things, and then system 2, which is conscious, articulated, and, everything I just talked about. So the benefits of doing neuroscientific testing it's funny, when I first thought about using this approach, I had to fight my own bias to think like, well, this feels very kind of hippy-dippy, kumbaya, we're going to put a headset on people and just what? But actually, when you think about it, it's and again, I think surveys have values, but the surveys are actually a bit more of the hippy-dippy, kumbaya, let's, hold hands and talk about our feelings. And in neuroscientific research is actually going to evaluate actual feelings in a quantifiable way, moment by moment. So we actually see cause and effect in real time, and we can actually, I believe, derive more meaningful insights. So here's how we did it at Radware. First off, we didn't do it at Radware. We did it, we commissioned a company called Saren to actually assist us in managing the research. Saren actually acquired Foveant, so I looked for Foveants and you kind of had to follow a bit of down a rabbit hole and found Saren. And then they corralled two other companies, Neurostrata, which actually has the labs and all the technology, and another company called Neurosense, which is, they focus on just actually developing methodologies, like so you can actually derive meaningful results and working with your original hypotheses. And they're all great. They're fantastic. They're all based in the UK. I can't recommend them enough. And because they were in the UK and we knew we were getting people, basically British people in a lab, we focused on 4 UK-based sites. So John Lewis and Tesco, which are shopping sites, kind of analogous to Amazon, widely used, and then EasyJet and Ryanair, which are airline sites. So we wanted to see, we wanted to look at the e-commerce experience, and then we kind of wanted to differentiate a little bit and look at the travel experience, because our feeling was that travel is trying to book travel, especially over your phone, is possibly a more stressful experience, and we wanted to actually isolate that as separate from the e-commerce experience. And so our test participants, we had 24 participants, and I'm going to talk about that small group in a second. 12 male, 12 female. They were pre-screened to ensure normal cognitive functioning. I actually have no idea how you pre-screen someone to ensure normal cognitive functioning. But I trusted our group. They seemed normal. But there was some pre-screening involved. And we wanted to make sure they were experienced mobile device users. They were all between the ages of 25 and 45. And most important, they did not know they were part of a performance study. They thought they were just doing regular usability testing. So we were asking them to perform tasks, and how easy was it for them to do those tasks, and what were their feelings about the sites, and all those more touchy-feely usability testing questions. Why our group was so small? This came from a great Jacob Nielsen finding. Does anyone here follow Jacob Nielsen at all? Yeah, okay, great. I'm a bit of a Jacob Nielsen disciple from way back, and he wrote back in 2000 for a lot of usability testing, why you actually, if you want to iterate quickly, you only need 5 or 6 users. And that's because he found that over time, you really get most of your results, about 90% of your results with that first 5 or 6% of testers. If you test it with a much bigger group than that, yeah, you'll get about 10% more in terms of your takeaways. But is the payoff worth it? Is it worth investing in getting all those extra people in your lab? So he believes in iterating quickly, as do I. And so, with small test groups. Just a little note about how we used our testers. We didn't have people experience the same site twice. Like, we didn't give them a fast and, I'm getting ahead of myself. Here's what we did. We gave them a standardized sets of shopping tasks. So basically had them all do the same set of tests. So basically buying a laptop through the e-commerce sites and then booking travel through the travel sites. And from start to finish. And they were served sites over one of 2 speeds. So they were either given just normal Wi-Fi, or they were given basically an entire experience that had an artificially introduced 500 millisecond network delay. So it kind of added up to about 2 or 3 seconds of total delay. It's a little bit hard to pinpoint that down, but 500 millisecond network delay. And people did not experience the same site twice. So we didn't, if somebody was on the Tesco site, we didn't serve them the fast version of the page and then the slow version of the page. We kind of mixed them all up. And no one person got all slow experiences, and no single person got all fast experiences. So we made sure that we mix it up evenly. And then we use the EEG headsets, which you saw in the earlier photo, pretty lightweight. And it's actually the reason why we're able to do this kind of testing, is because the technology has become really easy to use. use, relatively easy to use, and lightweight and affordable. Courtney Nash, when I presented this at Velocity in London, she actually has a neuroscience background, and she was talking about her days back in the lab when the headsets were massive, and then you had to worry about just the fact that somebody was wearing this massive headset, totally skewing their responses, because nobody behaves normally when they've got big electrodes actually attached to their heads. So we used this very lightweight device and eye tracking technology, just to make sure that people were actually using the pages and were on the pages we wanted to be, so we could actually correlate the EEG readout with what people were seeing on the page, and we measured the responses moment by moment. So that's what it looked like. And we gave them a little while to acclimatize themselves to wearing this. We gave them some warm-up tasks. And then by the end, they're kind of everybody was sitting in this kind of comfortable reception room kind of environment, no distractions, anything like that. And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit later too. And why we tested a 500 millisecond delay? Well, it goes back to the earlier study we did where we found that 500 millisecond delays were where we started to see an impact on business metrics. So for us, everything has to come back to business metrics. So this is for us. So when we looked at all the data, we ran through the tests, and there were a bunch of different metrics that we gathered from the EEG data, but we focused for our purposes on the metrics that were most affected by the 500 millisecond delay. So others were marginally affected, but not enough to be statistically interesting or meaningful. And these metrics were frustration, which is a negative emotion, and then emotional engagement, which is the opposite of frustration. It's a positive emotion. This is what it looked like. You can see the different metrics. We've got the red. Red is the emotional engagement. Blue is frustration, and you can see how those on one page of the transaction they add to basket. So just for your interest, this was I just tested, I had them test the baseline speed of the page of the different sites. So just so you know, just the home pages, this is how they perform pretty fast over Wi-Fi, like kind of 2.66 to 4.24 seconds, not bad. And so we measured everybody. These are the results from people who, in terms of frustration level, across all the sites at normal speed. And you see the results side by side, John Lewis, Tesco, and you can see that John Lewis is lower, Tesco is higher, Ryanair is pretty high as well. The purpose of this exercise wasn't to compare the brands to each other. I mean, that might be something that those companies would be interested in, is just like what are people's sort of baseline expectations or feelings about the brand. But for our purposes, we just graphed it this way because we could see all the data at once. And we didn't just focus on frustration level and engagement. We also focused on the points in the transaction when these spikes were most evident, and that was at browsing and at the basket. So not at the home page, not at the product page, at the browsing levels, basically the search and browse level, and then during checkout. Those were the two areas where we saw the most interesting readouts. And again, engagement levels across the sites, you can see, very positive engagement for John Lewis, lower for Tesco's and Ryanair. But again, it's not meant to be a side-by-side exercise, just our baseline. So this kind of shows you peak frustration results for when we introduced the 500 millisecond delay. And what was really interesting about this was that consistently we saw spikes. What's also really interesting is that there was no single consistent way that the spikes manifested themselves. So you can see here that for the John Lewis site, there was a 26% increase in frustration during the browsing phase, but kind of more or less the same during checkout. You see that and kind of the same for EasyJet. But then with Ryanair, you see a 22% increase during checkout, not so much during browsing. And the interesting kind of odd man out is Tesco, which actually saw a decrease in frustration whenever the pages were slowed down. So I don't want to get into analyzing, why those results were the way they were. We had some speculative, a lot of speculative conversation, which was around how the pages themselves load, and it also kind of points back to something that Jacob Nielsen wrote about I think last summer or last fall, which was actually that sometimes the pages load too quickly. It stresses people out, but that's actually a page, how the page is built and how the page is rendering problem. So if you have objects flying in from all over, things are janking and moving around, that actually can be really, really annoying and stressful for people. But if you slow the page down and the page kind of renders in a more orderly, systematic fashion, then it's easy for people to process. So the takeaway here isn't make your pages slower; people will be happier. It's if you're doing this kind of research, look at your pages themselves and actually look at how the page is rendering. So with engagement, same deal. We saw results. We not quite as dramatic as the frustration results, but we definitely saw spikes in engagement up to 8%, and decreases in engagement, or sorry, I should say decreases in engagement, not spikes. And except for Ryanair, which had an increase in engagement with the slower site during checkout. And again, it goes back to what I was just talking about. And we looked at the Ryanair checkout page, and we just sort of figured it's actually just so busy, and there's so many results on it that, and so many objects on it. It was the only. I should add also that it was the only one of the sites that didn't have an MDOT site. So it was a very, very different looking page from the other pages. And we were just wondering if perhaps just the fact that it had so much stuff on it, it was easier to process when all those objects came in a little bit more slowly. But again, totally speculation. Sorry, just seeing how much time we have left. Oh, good, okay. So the other thing we did was we did what one usually does during usability tests, where we did exit interviews with people, where as they were finishing each test, we interviewed them and asked them, like, what did you think about the site? What did you think about the brand? How would you rate your shopping experience? And all those kinds of questions. And we took all of the adjectives that people use to describe the sites, and we fed them into a word cloud generator. And what's really interesting is that the top left word cloud is an example of the word cloud that we generated for the Tesco site for all the people who use the regular kind of optimal version of the site. And the words that jump out at you are easy to use, easy to buy from, quick. And there are some negative words in there too, ugly, confusing, that sort of thing. But by and large, the words were mostly negative. The interesting thing about the word cloud for the people who experience the slower version of the site isn't just the words that jump out at you, like slow and tacky, clunky, boring, confusing, frustrating, is the sheer number of words that people used. People wanted to talk more about the slower site. They had more to say about it, even though they didn't, again, were in no way aware that what they were being tested on was how fast and slow the pages were. And how they responded to them. People had more to say, and even though there are negative words in both clouds, the number of negative words in the slow cloud is 3 times higher than the number of negative words in the fast cloud. So, just as a user experience person, I just found this super fascinating. The other thing that was interesting was the type of words they used weren't just about slowness. If pages aren't fast, then everything suffered. People's perception of the content thought it was boring. The visual design, they thought the design was tacky and confusing. And the navigation, they found it frustrating and hard to navigate. So again, all these words, people were not saying that because they thought that, they were correlating these words with slowness. They just felt that way about the site in a way that people who experienced a faster site didn't. I find that really, really interesting. So our test summary here was that a 500 millisecond delay has a measurable impact on users. Faster pages generally result in a higher levels of engagement. That engagement and frustration shifts for different people or for the different sites at different points in the transaction process, and that slowness affected the entire perception of the site. And important takeaway, I talked earlier about the fact that we put people in a very comfortable environment with a good connection. Ideal browsing conditions, which we don't have on mobile as a rule. So I'm just going to illustrate with a little quick case in point here. This is the airport that I fly out of every time I come to a conference. I live in a small mountain town, and this airport, it looks like a trailer because I think it's actually built around a trailer, so it's very, very, very small. And it's in the mountains, so, it says it has Wi-Fi. I've never actually had the Wi-Fi work for me, and I don't know why that big ladder is there. maybe for climbing on top of planes. There's no planes big enough that require a ladder that large that fly into this airport. And last fall, I was flying to Velocity in London, and as often happens, we have a 30 to 50% cancellation rate at this airport. In the wintertime because of low cloud cover. And so my flight got canceled. And I knew I had to be at Velocity the next day. So I was frantically on my phone trying to figure out, well, what other airports can I fly out of? Because there are a few other regional airports and they all have different weather patterns, blah, blah, blah. And I'm frantically on my phone. And also my husband had driven me to the airport. We have one car, so he drove me to drop me off. And he stuck around to see if my flight was actually going to leave. And so while I'm on my phone with Wi-Fi not working and 3G that's going in and out, I have 2 kids, 6 and 9, both boys, and they're running around this airport, because they've never been there before. It was really exciting for them. There was a Christmas tree in the corner, so they thought that was awesome. And so I was trying to book a new flight at other airports with 3G dropping in and out, switching phones with my husband as my 3G dropped out, and he would pass me his phone, and I would try it on his. And my kids running around, and I'm trying not to get them to let them, overturn the Christmas tree. And I can guarantee you, if I'd been wearing a headset at that particular moment in time, my frustration spike would have been a lot more than 26%, and possibly right off the roof. So I have actually, there was a bonus study that we did. I kind of stuck these slides in here hoping that I would get a chance to talk about it. I am running out of time, I think. Am I good? Am I good? Oh, good. Okay, cool. So I'm gonna. So while we had all these people in the lab, Neurostrata and Sarah said, well, let's just get them to do some other tests. And I said, sure, why not? What do you want to do? And they said, well, let's do some implicit response testing. And I thought, cool, what's that? And so they told me. And has anyone here had any experience with implicit response testing? Okay, sort of, kind of. Oh, okay, yeah. So the what's this site right here, Project Implicit? Did you do it? Yeah, I did that too. It was really cool. So I'm going to back up for a second. So implicit response testing is predicated on the idea that we react faster to congruent stimuli than to incongruent stimuli. So the classic, like the Stroop effect, the Stroop test, which is goes back to the 1930s, is that if you have to you have to identify what a color is, you're going to identify that color faster a word. You're going to identify the color that word is faster if the word is the same color as opposed to the word being a different color. Sorry, got that out. If you want to test it out, I highly recommend it. It's really fun. Go to Project Implicit. It's a project of I want to say Harvard. Yeah, it's a Harvard Labs. It's really neat. And they've been collecting this data for ages, so you can go in there, do some testing, and then your stuff will get aggregated with a whole lot of other people's tests. And I don't know what they use it for. So how it works, basically we do something called a pretest. So first identify 24 attributes along four different areas: affinity, functional attributes like great service, first class, purchase intent, just all the things that make you more likely to buy something. Are they trusted? Is it easy to use? Does it give good value? Progressive, is it modern and cutting edge? And so we took 2 brands, EasyJet and Ryanair. And the way the test worked is, this is what people would see on a screen, and they were told to, basically they would see 2 words, or they would see EasyJet and Ryanair, see the word luxurious, and then the word EasyJet would pop up on the screen, and they were to click an E if the word that popped up after luxurious was EasyJet, or an R if the word that popped up after luxurious is Ryanair. And implicit response theory is that if people actually feel that EasyJet is a luxurious brand, they will actually click that E faster. And if they feel that Ryanair is not a luxurious brand, their response will be slowed down. And so we did a pre-test. So basically, again, just serving a baseline site just to map people's perception of the brands. And I only posted this slide, which shows the results side by side, not for the sake of comparing them. Although, again, if these were my brands, I would care about this graph, but just to show how we map the data. And this is how it looked for in terms of all the attributes around purchase intent. So you can see, EasyJet, pretty trusted, high perception of value, et cetera, et cetera. And then we had participants view a video depicting someone going through a flight selection and booking process. So half the people saw the normal version and the other half saw a slowed down version. And then we tested them again against the same 24 attributes. So gave them exactly the same test that they had done the first time. Mixed up the orders of the words and that sort of thing, so it wasn't in exactly the same order. And the thinking is that the difference between normal and slow indicates the effective speed on brand perception. So this was the impact of the 500 millisecond slowdown on each of the 4 main dimensions for EasyJet. So you can see, there's a clear, measurable impact, especially in the functional and more importantly on the purchase intent areas. And then across the attributes, you see that there's an impact across pretty much every attribute that you would care about if this was your site. And same deal with Ryanair. Again, we saw more of an impact on functional and less of an impact on purchase intent, which is really interesting. And is anyone here familiar with Ryanair? Anyone from the UK? Yeah, apparently, I didn't know this. Apparently, it has a really bad reputation, lots of bad PR moments over there. And so we speculated that perhaps they just didn't have as much to lose, which is why the purchase intent hit wasn't as painful as it was for EasyJet. And again, we see the impact of the slowdown across the attributes as well. Sorry, I'll just go back to that one for a second. Okay. So what we took away from this, and this is really interesting, and when they told me they were going to do this study, I was kind of like, okay, sure, whatever. But I actually found this really interesting, and as interesting as what we did with the headsets. Just the fact that, again, that same 500 millisecond delay triggered a negative impact, in perception for both the companies that we tested. So it's consistent, it was measurable. And the impact is different. So this is where you really need to, I think, be honest with yourself about how your brand is perceived by the general public, and maybe that's where the pretest comes in. You can actually look at your pretest results and say like, "Ooh, we're not really doing that well." Or maybe if I were the owner of an e-commerce brand, I would perhaps get people in this kind of environment, and I would have them. I would test them alongside my competitors and just see like, how do I map compared to my competitors? And so this, there's been a lot of talk about healthcare.gov in our community since it launched last fall, and then crashed and burned, and then was beautifully bailed out by some really hardworking people in our industry. But just sort of talking about the impact of performance on brand perception. What was interesting to me as I watched all that happen from the mountains of Canada was that it started out when things first started going awry. It was like, oh God, this site isn't working very well. That's really too bad. And then it turned into, oh, this site isn't working very well. What's wrong with healthcare.gov? Like, this whole program must be a mess. And then it's, oh, the site isn't working very well. Therefore, the program is a mess. Therefore, Barack Obama is not a good leader. And this was the cover of Bloomberg in November of last fall, where you can see it's a very, very telling visual that they used to question his leadership. And so it was just really interesting to me to see how a website's performance was conflated to the brand perception, for lack of a better word, of a major world leader. And I just thought that was really interesting. So takeaways here are, again, slow web performance, clear measurable impact on people at a core level. People feel web stress even when shopping under ideal circumstances, and that's obviously going to be inflated when, in the real world when we're in our less ideal conditions. That slow sites affect brand health across different in different areas of a transaction, and generally we found the greatest risk is to purchase intent. So if you're an e-commerce site, it's that purchase intent that's most affected. But the positive is that there are obviously excellent opportunities to improve your brand by improving performance. And for me, just at a personal level, and what I hope will be the takeaway from this is just doing this research, this first round of research, was a bit of a proof of concept for us that you can actually derive meaningful, interesting results, and you can use them, you can apply them in the real world. So at Radware, we're using this research now in a kind of our next step is actually it's going to help us to develop certain product features where we're going to figure out, for example, we're testing progressive image rendering. Do people engage earlier with a page if images load progressively versus when we serve a baseline image? So we're going to be experimenting with just, are we chasing, the wrong dragon tail whenever, when we're advocating one type of image rendering over another. And I feel that because this technology is affordable, relatively affordable, accessible, relatively easy to use and relatively easy to iterate on, I would really like to see this actually get pulled into usability test labs more often. And kind of my larger sort of cause that I want to advocate for is that I feel that user experience testing, usability testing, should actually include performance, and it doesn't right now for most people. It's kind of more, were you able to complete a task? What color button did you like? So I think I've gone over it. This is the study if you want to download it, radware.com/mobileEEG 2013. And if you have any questions, am I out of time? Yeah. Okay, sorry, I went over. I'll be in my office hour. I'll also be over at the Radware booth, and you can, these are my sources. I'll be posting these on my blog, Web Performance Today, later today. And you can find me online. I'm Tam Everts on Twitter. Thanks.